Hey, Pat and Chris back for another Ranger episode of Shop Talk, where we're outside in the field. Chris, what are we covering today?
Pat, today we're going to be talking about how to get the most out of your XD 1500. Some of the things that make the vehicle unique. We're going to demonstrate driving the vehicle and on a transmission cutaway, so stay tuned.
All right, so Chris, we jumped on the inside of this Ranger XD 1500, and I think let's start out talking about shifting and some of the differences on this Ranger versus maybe other Rangers people are used to, right?
Yeah, let's do it. First thing you're going to notice is this has a shifter, just like any other Ranger, but it's a little bit different. So first thing is, Pat, you're trying to move the shifter.
Yeah.
Not moving.
Got to have your foot on the brake to get this thing out of park. Super important to know.
Yep.
The other thing that's important is it's labeled right on the top, but you got park, reverse, and drive. So, you know, no high-low gear in this gearbox and no neutral in this gearbox that's on the shift handle. So we'll get to that in just a minute. I think another important thing for people to be aware of is you always got to bring this thing back to park when you actually, you know, get out of it. Because if you leave it in drive, key it off, you know, walk away, key it back on, it'll actually tell you shift to park because it won't let you start the engine unless you get the thing back into park. Now, one of the other ones that people ask is, where the heck is neutral?
Yeah,
right?
where's
like,
that?
Where's that? Well, there's a little cover down by your right knee. You guys can probably see the big warning label on here. But it's pretty simple. If you ever need to tow this vehicle or roll it without the engine running or powered, you basically pop this cover, turn the handle 90 degrees, pull a lever, and now you're in neutral, and that'll be indicated on the dash for you.
And that's an important one. You never want to get towed or have somebody try to recover this vehicle unless you're in neutral, because that can cause damage to the transmission.
Right.
So the other unique thing about the shifter is that it doesn't have high and low, and that's because we can control the engine and transmission characteristics through the drive modes.
And that's another unique thing on this XD 1500. You got this knob on the left side, you know, it says drive and mode with arrows on both that you can rotate, and then tow haul push. So we got three different modes really on this one. You rotate this knob either counterclockwise or clockwise. You can go either way, and if you keep going, it'll just rotate it around. Now, when you start out in comfort, you know, to me, this is like the mode I'm cruising around in the morning or coming back to camp, right? Nice, yep. Low engine, you know, speed, right? Quiet operation, kind of a little lazier, you know, I'll say getting going and slowing down, but just kind of a cruising mode, right?
Yeah, we're just trying to be really smooth. So it's going to accelerate really smoothly. It's also going to decelerate really smoothly with less engine braking in this mode.
Nice. All right, so now if we go to standard, this is kind of what you're used to in most other Rangers, right? It's going to be about the acceleration, about the slowdown characteristics you're used to. It's going to kind of backshift like you're used to. You know, when you think of standard, think of every other Ranger you've ever been in and the way it's going to behave and drive. Now, sport, a little bit different here, right?
Yep.
What's that one going to do for us?
The goal is really to maximize acceleration. We also maximize deceleration with more engine braking in sport mode.
Yeah, so again, this is going to rev the engine a little quicker as you tip into that throttle. It's going to get the vehicle moving a little bit faster. You know, a little more if you're kind of, you know, maybe out trail riding versus standing around or, you know, cruising around doing work.
Yep, you'll notice that that's going to be louder in the vehicle, and you're also going to feel it be a lot more abrupt as you're accelerating and decelerating.
Sure. Now, last thing here, when you push this in, it'll actually say tow/haul. Now, the cool thing about tow haul is it's not just for towing and hauling, right? It's actually kind of your technical riding or really your work mode. So when you need those, you know, times where you need a little extra oomph, you know, maybe you're loaded up with people and gear, or you're up in the mountains, you know, trying to go up the pass. It actually enables a feature called torque boost. And the cool thing about that is if you're stationary, you take your foot off the brake when you're in drive and you push that throttle all the way to the floor. It's actually going to rev the engine up quickly, and it's going to try to basically fully lock up the wet clutch and transfer that power delivery into the steel belt portion of the STEELDRIVE transmission. We'll show you what that looks like in a minute, but remember that tow haul is really your technical riding mode, especially if you're carrying a lot of people or gear, or you're up at altitude where you got thinner air and you need to get a little higher up on that torque curve to get the vehicle moving. That torque boost is going to be your best friend. All right, so we got two buttons on the left side of the dash here. One says unlock, you know, shows a picture of the rear end, and the other one's all-wheel drive. Starting out with the rear end, this one's pretty simple. You tap the button, and it's actually going to unlock the rear differential. So if the light's on that button, and it's not flashing, and you look at your gauge and you see one of the two back wheels illuminated and lit up, you're basically in turf mode, just like you're used to on any other Ranger. Now, just remember, you got to be in drive or reverse for that turf to enable. So if you're in park, you may actually see that light flashing. There's nothing wrong with that, but anytime you shift into park, it's going to relock that rear diff. And if you see that thing flashing, it means you tried to put it in turf mode, but the vehicle is telling you it's not ready to go into it yet. So always look at what's on the gauge to know what's actually happening. But if you see that light flashing on the dash, no big deal. It just means you got to shift into gear to allow that rear end to unlock. Now the other button we've got is all-wheel drive. This one's super easy. You push that one down, the light lights up again. You see both wheels are going to be illuminated on the dash. So right now I've got a locked rear end. I've got the front wheel drive in all-wheel drive. So all 4 wheels are pulling, in this driveline mode. Now the cool thing on this Ranger XD 1500 is we've actually got Ultra Turf, right? Yep. So if I tap the bottom button to unlock the rear diff, as I look at the dash now, I can see both front wheels and one rear are lit up. So Chris, when would you use that mode? Like, unique to the Ranger XD 1500, but where is it really good to, for operation?
Actually, Pat, right where we're at today out at the Polaris field is a great example of where we'd like to use Ultra Turf. So we've got this huge grass field that we don't want to tear up, so we don't want to have a locked rear differential, but we're also surrounded by trails. So if we get out in the woods and get into some nastier ground, it's nice to have the front end engaged so that if the rear slips, it'll pull us forward. But we also know that if we pull back onto the grass and forget to disengage the rear end, we're not going to tear up the grass.
Nice. So super versatile mode. Good when you're going kind of in and out of places you don't want to mess up, but you still got enough traction where you're not just one wheel wandering.
All right, guys, we rolled this cutaway of the XD 1500 steel drive transmission out here. And what we want to do is have Pat take you guys through what's happening inside the transmission while different things are happening on the vehicle. So Pat, why don't we start with what happens when you get in the vehicle, put your seatbelt on, turn the key?
Yeah, so obviously at that point you should be in park. Park ball should be engaged. That's going to lock the output shaft and the driven clutch here. But the input shaft's still going to be freely spinning. That's important to note. What you're going to see is these wet clutches are going to be spinning but not engaged. You're going to see the rest of this rotating shaft assembly basically stationary. But the gear set way at the end, this is the oil pump drive, that's going to be spinning. That's important because that's really what's building all the hydraulic pressure that we're going to be controlling to move around to the various different parts of this trans.
Okay, so the engine's running now, input shafts turn in, both wet clutches are turning, and the oil pump is pumping. What happens when you shift into reverse or drive?
Yeah, so let's see if, I don't know if I can get this shaft, this cutaway lined up right so we can actually see. But as we take that shifter and throw it into reverse, it's going to unlock that park ball. It's going to position this up a little and start the hydraulic flow, basically going to this first clutch pack. And this is the reverse pack of this transmission. And as we start to basically engage that with more hydraulic pressure, it's actually, and I'm going to kind of just do it with my finger to simulate it, but as you turn that input shaft one way, it's going to turn this rotating assembly the opposite direction through a planetary gear set right down here, kind of between these two clutch packs. That's going to give you about a 1.1 gear reduction in reverse versus forward. And as you see, as you're spinning that input shaft one way, the whole belt is actually spinning the opposite way. So it's basically shifted out all the way down or close to it. I've maybe been playing with this one a little bit. But it's basically going to cause the output shaft to spin the opposite direction that it would when you're, in forward gear.
All right, so that's how reverse works. Now, Pat, is forward just the opposite?
Yeah, pretty much. So as you look, you shift this, you shift your gear handle up, goes down to the bottom, pushes this thing up, and basically then what we're going to do is instead of putting hydraulic fluid to this clutch pack, we're going to put it to this one. And what you'll see then is that as the input shaft is spinning, as that one starts to lock up, the belt is going to move in the same rotation direction as the input shaft is. So yeah, that's basically the real difference between forward and reverse. Is reverse, you got one clutch pack and a planetary. In forward, you've got the second clutch pack, the first one's off, and you're not going through that planetary. So really, you're changing the direction that the input shaft is spinning, which is different than a lot of our transmissions, where that happens kind of after the secondary based on where the clutches are in relation to the gear sets.
Now, Pat, you mentioned something called torque boost. Can you talk about what's happening in the transmission when we use torque boost?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things to remember is you got to push that button on the dash like we showed you guys when we were in the cockpit. And really what that's going to try to do as you pull your foot off the brake and put the throttle all the way to the floor, is that it's basically going to attempt to lock up this wet clutch as fast as it possibly can so that you're transferring power 100% to the steel belt versus slipping that clutch. Now, where that's important is in areas where you're doing, really heavy work, going up really big inclines or really at high altitude. Because as you think about it, as you get up in those higher climates, 6, 8, 10,000 feet, as that air's getting thinner, you're actually producing less power at a given engine speed. And by allowing that engine to throttle up, to a higher RPM, you're actually gonna move yourself on that torque curve to a higher point, which is what's needed to get this vehicle moving, especially if you got, a fully loaded crew full of people, in that condition. But effectively what it's gonna do is put as much hydraulic pressure as needed on these discs, get them to fully engage, so that as you're turning, it's gonna put the power transfer through here and then start to move these drive and driven clutches more quickly. But you also need to remember that it needs to get the vehicle going somewhere in that kind of 8, 10, 12 mile an hour range, and it depends on loading conditions and altitude exactly where it is. For this belt or this wet clutch to stop slipping and get that full power transfer over. So not only do you want to not just like ease into the throttle in that mode, you want to really get into it all the way to the floor, let the engine spool up, let it be a little louder, and let the vehicle get moving before you back your foot out of it and then kind of get back to normal trail riding.
So things to remember for torque boost are you got to push the button, be in tow haul mode, and you want to move that accelerator pedal all the way to the floor to engage it, so that this wet clutch can engage as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to remember too is that, as you're going, maybe you get to a spot that's a little hairier on the trail, or you gotta, get up and over an obstacle. Instead of just holding it with your foot on the throttle, always get your foot back to the brake when you're not moving, and then you can re-engage that mode if you need to. And if you get to the point where, it'll say that, hey, you've got an over temp in your transmission, really that's a modeled temp of this clutch. It's not that it's necessarily actually too hot, it's that we're protecting it from getting too hot before it damages itself. And if you hold your foot on the brake and just let that machine idle for, half a minute up to maybe a couple minutes, it cools down very rapidly, and you can see that transmission temperature right on the gauge. So it's not like you got to sit there for hours on end waiting for it to cool down like an old carbureted, vehicle that's vapor locking or something. Give it a little bit of time. Make sure you're in tow haul, get your foot all the way to the floor on that throttle, and try again to get up and over that obstacle.
All right, let's hop in the vehicle and show some of these things.
All right, we got Chris in the driver's seat, and we're gonna have him go through some of these driveline and drive modes. So Chris, why don't you fire this thing up, shift it into drive, and get your hands on the steering wheel and take your feet off both pedals. And now here we can actually see what this creep functionality looks like. So the machine is barely moving, makes it really easy for getting it in and out of the shed, your pole building, maybe loading or unloading, some of those conditions where you don't want to be moving very quickly. And now Chris, why don't you start throttling into this thing, and we'll see just, how nice and quiet it is, how that thing's easy to drive away. Makes it really simple, really nice. You can carry on a conversation. Clearly I'm outside the cabin, he's got the window open, but it makes it really easy. Now, when he loops back around, we're gonna run you guys through those driveline modes. So we're gonna have him switch between turf, two-wheel drive, ultra turf, and all-wheel drive. We're gonna have him just drive in some circles, and we'll kind of show you the differences on what's going on in each of those modes. All right, so we got Chris in turf, and he's gonna start doing some tighter circles here. Now what we should see as he goes around is that the outside wheel in the back is actually gonna be spinning faster than the inside wheel is. And you guys should be able to hopefully pick that up on the camera. Where the outside wheel is cruising, the inside wheel is going a bit slower, and the grass is basically getting pushed down and popping back up, but he's not tearing the roots out. So it makes it nice and easy when you're in turf to be able to get some of that slow speed operation while you're in the grass. And now we're gonna have him switch to two-wheel drive. And what that's gonna do is lock that rear differential, and it's gonna force both back wheels to go at exactly the same speed. And what you start to notice now is that inside tire is actually lifting the grass, where it's starting to pull some of those roots out because it's forced to spin at the same speed the outside tire is, so it's actually slipping as it goes around, and that's where you see that it's tearing the grass up a little, and it's actually damaging the turf a bit. So two-wheel drive, both wheels spinning at the same speed, and you get a little bit more damage when you're in a soft terrain like this grass, where that turf might be advantaged, especially in the small flatland like we are now. Now, Chris, we're gonna have you switch to ultra turf. So in this one, it's like turf in the back, rear end's unlocked, and it's engaged the all-wheel drive system in the front. Now, the cool thing about ultra turf is that the front end, unless the rear wheels are really slipping, isn't gonna be doing much. So this one should look a lot like it did when he was in turf, where that outside rear tire is going faster than the inside, and the grass is really not getting torn up at all, right? That outside wheel's faster, inside one's slower, and the front wheels, because the back end has good traction, are kind of along for the ride right now. So unless he's in real slippery or bad terrain, this mode is basically very similar to turf, but it's like enabled and ready to have those front wheels work when you need them to. Now, Chris, go to all-wheel drive. So now he's gonna rear lock that rear end, and it's gonna look a lot like it did in two-wheel drive. So as he goes, you're gonna see that the back end now, both wheels have to spin at the same speed again, and that inside tire is gonna be chewing up the grass a little bit. Whereas the front has good traction here, so still light steering effort, easy for him to maneuver. But that back wheel is actually churning and chewing a little because it's trying to catch up to the outside tire that has to spin faster to make that bigger arc. Now, I think the next thing we want to do is actually run through the various drive line modes. We'll have you go through comfort, then standard, then sport, then tow haul. All right, so now the nice part here is you can hear that vehicle is super quiet. You know, he's gradually pulling away. Really easy to have a conversation with your passenger. Makes it really nice for, you know, tooling around while you're maybe near more, you know, areas on the property. You know, you got to get around, or, you know, you just want that comfortable, easy to, you know, take off ride. It's going to have pretty, you know, non-aggressive back shifting. So if you're coming down a hill, it's going to let you kind of, you know, freewheel a little bit more. So comfort is kind of easy to get going, easy to slow down. Think of it that way when you're in comfort mode. Now, next thing he's going to do is shift this thing to standard, do the same thing again, and hopefully he'll get his foot about to the same angle at the same rate. And you can see it's a little louder, it's accelerating a little bit faster, but it looks mostly like you'd expect a Ranger to look, right? It's going to feel just like you've had in other Rangers you've experienced. It's going to give you kind of the driving characteristics, both on acceleration and deceleration you're most used to. So both from the, you know, getting moving as well as the decelerating. All right, so now we're going to have Chris go to the sport mode, and we're going to listen to this one as he accelerates away. All right, so you guys can clearly hear that that engine's spooling up a little bit higher, the vehicle's a little bit louder, and he's taking off a little bit quicker. So sport mode's all about how do you get going a little faster, you know, how do you get a little more aggressive on the decel. But it's, you know, it's just a mode where if you're tooling through the trail, maybe having a little more fun, you know, for a guy like me that likes going maybe a little bit faster, you know, sport mode's one I'm going to use on an XD. All right, now when he comes back, we're going to have him go into tow haul. And this one's, you know, a little bit different than the others because it's more catered to doing work or technical riding. So push that button and get yourself into tow haul and do it one more time. All right, what you notice now is it's kind of going back to what we experienced a little bit with comfort, where it's not as loud as it was in sport, but he's got a lot of control in that vehicle. Now the top speed is going to be limited in that mode, which is good for doing work or technical riding applications. And he's also going to get more aggressive deceleration, like if he's going down a hill. So that tow haul mode, really good for technical riding. Think, you know, both doing work, hauling a trailer, but also if you're up at altitude, going through mountain passes, you know, really rocky terrain, that kind of stuff, that tow haul mode is going to be your best friend. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is give you guys some real life areas where the torque boost function might come in handy. So we've actually gone to the corner of the property where we've got a little bit of a rock crawl section that's, you know, in the terrain here. You can see we've got some smaller rocks, we got some medium-sized, you know, kind of boulderish type stuff. It's easy to get in, but there's a spot, you know, or two in here where you can really get hung up. So we're gonna have Chris drive in, kind of get himself wedged in a little bit. We're gonna have him put his foot on the brake, shift into all-wheel drive, get it into tow haul mode, and then we're gonna have him get off the brake and go full throttle to be able to rev that motor up, get the wheels and transmission engaging, and get him to kind of pop up and over and work his way up this obstacle. All right, so Chris is in ultra turf right now, like he's been driving around the trails. I think he's probably in the standard drive mode, and he's gonna start creeping into these rocks a little bit. So keep going forward, Chris. We'll see if we can find you a bigger rock that's gonna slow you down more. All right, so right about there. Now, if you rev that motor and hold it at about 2,500 RPM, maybe a little less than that, you'll see his back wheels are starting to spin, fronts aren't doing anything. So Chris, slow down so you're not spinning those back tires, but just keep into the throttle a little. So we're gonna purposely put some heat into that starting clutch. Now we're gonna simulate the torque boost. So Chris, put your foot on the brake, shift this thing into all-wheel drive, put it into tow haul mode, and then when you get off the brake, I want you to put the throttle to full throttle. And we're gonna watch while all four wheels engage, and he should rev the motor up and climb right up and over the rocks that he's pointing into. So go ahead whenever you're ready, Chris. Yep, now you see he was able to get those wheels spinning, and once he got the wheels moving, he was able to get out of it and then gently climb up the rest of the pile. So overall, that's torque boost for you, able to get you unstuck from a hairy situation. Very useful when you get into that technical terrain.
All right, thanks everybody for watching. This episode was all about how to get the most out of your XD 1500.
Hey, make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next episode of Shop Talk.